College. Her main area of study includes the 19th century American West, and some of her publications have appeared in the Encyclopedia of Immigration, Migration, and American West, the Overland Journal, and documentary editing. Today she'll be talking about her book, In Love and War, World War II Courtship Letters of the Nazi Couple, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, which was published in 2015 and recounts the wartime experience of her grandparents. Two second-generation Japanese, that got kind of dark here, Susan. Give me a little light, Susan. Susan, I just need just a little more. Those old eyes of mine aren't quite what they used to be. We need to read this, it's important. It recounts the wartime experience of her grandparents, two second-generation Japanese Americans, or Nazi, living in Hawaii. Their love story, narrated in letters they wrote each other from July 1941 to June 43, offers a unique view of Hawaiian Nazi and the social and cultural history of the territory of Hawaii during World War II. Please join me in welcoming Melody Walters. Thank you so much.
Aloha. Aloha. We're going to do that one more time. Aloha. Aloha. Got it. So I'm from Hawaii, as you may have guessed by that greeting. So when I start my presentations in Texas, I often start with aloha, and then there's silence. So you guys did a great job of jumping in. But sometimes I wonder if I should start with howdy. So maybe I'll do that next time. I'm the odd man out here, I realize, as I listen to the presentations today. As I said, I grew up in Hawaii. My research is on World War II Hawaii, and it is the story of someone who was not Audie and did not know Audie, and probably, no offense to Audie, never met him before and never heard of him. But we're going to jump in and we're going to try that anyway. So my book is entitled In Love and War, the World War II Courtship Letters of a Nisei Couple. I'm going to talk a little bit about the book as we go through, but what I wanted to point out as we look at this is the bigger picture of what was going on in Hawaii and for Japanese Americans in general. So if I talk too fast, because everybody always tells me slow down, I get super excited, my hands make all these gestures, so slow me down if I need to slow down. So I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about how I got invited to do this. Susan Lanning emailed me, and thank you so much for inviting me here today. And she asked me if I wanted to talk about my book for Audie Day. And I said, sure. And then I text my mom, and my mom says, the movie star? And that's when I realized that most people today know of Audie Murphy as the movie star, and not as World War II's most decorated combat veteran. And as I thought about that, I realized my book has even less to do with Audie Murphy than I thought I could make it sound like it did. So we'll see how this goes. But as I start here, I wanted to say Happy Audie Murphy Day to all of you. It's so exciting to see so many people here today. And I also wanted to take a moment to thank our servicemen and women. As you stood today and we saw the service that you put in, or we knew of the service that you've put in, we've heard your stories before, whether it's your particular story or a bigger story. I hope that everyone here and outside of just this auditorium can take a moment to appreciate all that you've done and all that Audie has done too. So just a quick thank you to all of you. So now to jump in. Hang on a second. Can I walk around, or do you need me to stay? You can walk around. I'm going to walk around. Can you all hear me? Is this one on? Okay. I'm going to walk around and talk while I do this so that I can advance the slides as we go through here. So I'm going to just work the laptop as I talk. I teach at Collin College, so I have a little bit of experience technology and panicking when it doesn't work correctly, so we'll go through this. So here's my picture of Audie Murphy, and then there is my picture of Yoshiharu Ogata. He is one of the co-stars of my book, and we're going to call him Ogie, because that's what some of his relatives call him. So we'll talk about Audie and Ogie. Audie and anti-Audie as they started, anti-Audie as they started off working on this presentation. So as you know, Audie Murphy was born in Texas. Ogie was born in Hawaii. Audie is of Irish descent. Ogie is of Japanese descent. So you can see here, as I was working on this, I thought there is nothing in common. There is no way that I can work this together. Audie Murphy, as you know, served for 3 years. I did some research, and thanks to Melissa Van Drew. Melissa, I haven't met you yet. Are you here? Melissa from the Audie Murphy Research Foundation was super helpful in getting me the pictures and extra information about Audie Murphy, so thank you so much for that. So when we look at these two, as I was saying, we have Audie Murphy, who served for 3 years. From what I found out, he served in North Africa, Italy, and France, and then I also heard the stories of how he jumped onto a burning tank and saved so many of his men. And then I looked at Yoshiharu Ogata, or Ogie as we're going to call him, who served 0 years. And in fact, my book goes into detail about how he didn't want to serve. He tried as hard as he could to get out of the draft for World War II. So again, the big difference is there. Audie Murphy, career, soldier, movie star, farmer, rancher. Yoshiharu Ogata, career, he was an industrial arts teacher. So again, very different. The only similarity that I could find there was that Ogie knew how to ride a horse, because he would tell us stories of going to high school on his horse. They didn't have a car, they couldn't afford a car, so he would ride his horse to school. And so that might be the one similarity that I could find in terms of their careers. And then the big similarity that I found at the end was they both had 2 children. That was a stretch, but that was as close as I could get for similarities there. So this is the character that I wanted to introduce to you as we get started here. And then we'll go into the next slide, please. I was shown this picture by Melissa here of Audie Murphy as he's prepping to be in a scene in Joe Butterfly. And this scene, and the next one, please, were pictures of Audie Murphy in Japan. Ogie, or Yoshiharu Ogata, had never been to Japan. So there's the big contrast there. You would think that perhaps the person of Japanese descent would have actually have gone to Japan, and the person of Irish descent would not have, but it's actually the opposite. So with this introduction, let's get started. Yoshiharu Ogata was born on Kauai, in the state of Hawaii, or wasn't in the state yet, but in Hawaii. This is a picture of his family here. Yoshiharu is, or Ogie, he's the one up here in this corner. And my guess is he was about 29 years old in that picture. And you can see his family there. They're all Japanese American. And the person in the middle, I don't know if you can tell, but he's in a wheelchair. He actually served in Europe in World War II when he was injured there. So when he returned to Hawaii, he was a paraplegic, and so he spent the rest of his life in a wheelchair. So that is Ogie's brother, who was a veteran. Ogie's story is much different. As I said, he didn't want to serve in the military. Instead, he wanted to be an industrial arts teacher. So now I want you to imagine an 18-year-old boy from Hawaii, Japanese American. He's Nisei, second generation Japanese American. So he was born in the United States, but his parents had immigrated from Japan. And that's part of why I talked about how he had never been to Japan before. So he's an American citizen of Japanese descent. Nisei, meaning 2, second generation. He was born in the United States. So he grew up on Kauai, and he knew that he wanted to be an industrial arts teacher. So when he's 18 years old, he graduates from high school as part of the first graduating class of Waimea High School. And he decides he's going to go to Wisconsin, because that's where there's a really good industrial arts school. So he gets in a boat, for the first time leaves Hawaii on a boat and sails, again, and he ships off to California. Once in California, then he has to get on a train. And now keep in mind, he had never been out of the Hawaiian Islands before. Gets on a train in California and rides all the way to Wisconsin. He gets to the Stout Institute in Wisconsin, and that's where he starts going to college. 18 years old, never been out of Hawaii before. I went to the University of Hawaii, and then I went to Arizona State University for my PhD. I was in school for 12 and a half years. I should say that a little quieter. I was in school for 12 and a half years. And so when I would go home for the summers, he would look at me and he would say, "Still in school?" Because for him, he finished college in 3.5 years. His family couldn't afford to get him back from Wisconsin on the train back to California, from California on the ship back to Hawaii. So he went to school during the summer, he went to school during the winter, and he finished in 3.5 years. That was a really big sacrifice for his family because they worked on a plantation, on sugar plantations, so they were the laborers. They lived in plantation housing, they worked for the plantation companies. It was very much a company town that he lived and grew up in. And so he knew what his family was sacrificing to send him to Wisconsin to go to school. But he goes anyway, and he's determined to come back to Hawaii and make a better living as a teacher instead of as a manual labor. So he comes back to Hawaii, and then he's going to live on Oahu as our story gets started. So that is my grandfather. Now, we'll go to the next slide, please. You probably went the right way. One more time. Okay. So my story picks up again then. In 2007, my grandfather passed away in June of 2007. And when we were cleaning out his closet, we found in a paper grocery bag letters that he and my grandmother had written to each other while they were courting. So they weren't married yet. And there were stacks and stacks of these letters just kind of in a paper bag stuffed away in the closet. You can see there the airmail envelopes because they were sent during the war. And we found the entire collection, except for her letters for a few months, of him writing to her while they were on different islands. And we have her correspondences back. And as a historian, this is gold for me, right? Because this is going to be information that we hadn't seen before about what life was like in Hawaii during World War II. And they're also written by Japanese Americans, so it's a very different side of the story than we usually hear when we read textbooks. And so I was very excited to work with these, and I read through them, and we found even more information. So all of this became my book, In Love and War, the World War II Courtship Letters of a Nisei Couple. You can see here that there are letters starting in July of 1941, and they continue on to, oh, I have a typo there, until June of 1943. Audie is on the island of Oahu, and then he moved to Kauai. And now for Tsukiyama, my grandmother, that I'll introduce next, was on Oahu, and then she moved to Big Island. So here's my map, and I just wanted to point out a few things for you, for those of you who are not too familiar with Hawaii. So that second island in, the second big one there, where you can see Diamond Head, you can see Honolulu, that's Oahu, that's where Pearl Harbor is, and that is where my grandmother, now Tsukiyama, grew up, and that's where they met. So he had gotten a job, Audie had gotten a job teaching industrial arts on Oahu, and my grandmother had just finished at the University of Hawaii, and she said, this is what she claimed, she used to go to the Catholic school near the YMCA to practice playing the organ. The rest of the story, though, is that the men were all at the YMCA, so they would go and they played badminton, and they would just socialize, and they had a good time. That was how they dated. So that's where they started off. But then, in the fall of 1941, she was sent to the Big Island here for her first teaching job. So she was teaching at an elementary school there. And so when she left in the fall, they continued to write to each other. She got sick, and we were never really sure what kind of sick she got, but she got a cold that was bad enough that she got sent home. She couldn't teach at the elementary school anymore. So she got sent back to Oahu, and she was there for the bombing of Pearl Harbor. So they were both there on December 7th, 1941. So let me give you a little bit of information about her, because this is the part that makes their story so different from many that we had heard before. So this is my picture of my grandmother's family. My grandmother's the oldest daughter, so she's the taller one in that picture, the taller girl in that picture. Her family was also Japanese American, so she too was a Nisei. Her parents immigrated from Japan. But my grandmother grew up very white, as you would have it. Her family was Christian. My grandfather's family was Buddhist. She grew up going to what they called an English normal school, which meant that her English was good enough that it was normal enough, I guess, because it's an English normal school. Her English was good enough that she could go to school with the white children in Hawaii. And they were shopkeepers. So my grandfather, very working class, struggling to make a living. My grandmother's family, very middle class, they owned a store. She would, whenever we talked about how they grew up, my grandmother would look down her nose at us. We didn't work in the plantations, we were merchants. So she was very proud of her very upper middle class childhood. They went to church, they did Easter egg hunts, they played baseball, so very American as you would have it. So it was very clear then how she felt about being an American. She knew that she was an American citizen. She grew up speaking English, as I said. She grew up very Christian. And so when we were going through all of their correspondences, we also came across this. I know you can't read it there. I'm going to read it for you because I think it's worth taking a look at. This is the reflection that she wrote on December 7th, 1941. So keep in mind, she was there on Oahu while Japan was bombing Pearl Harbor. My grandfather was there as well. He used to tell us stories about standing on the roof of his dorm building at the YMCA and seeing the bombs drop on Pearl Harbor. So he was there for that. But my grandmother, she did not stand on her roof. She was a proper lady. But she did write this on the evening of December 7th, 1941. This is the most incredible thing that has ever happened to us. All day long, we have hoped that the reports were false. It can't happen here. It's impossible, we have been telling ourselves. It is 4:30 now, and I believe now that the incredible has happened. Martial law has been declared in this territory by the governor, and it is true that Pearl Harbor and other areas have been attacked by planes. Japanese planes, they say, and I hear over a mainland broadcast that Japan has declared war on us. I can hardly believe that such a thing has happened. After these peace talks by special envoys in which I had hoped for so much success, to think that Japan can do this to us is unbelievable. That a nation whose people have some of the finest qualities I have known should resort to such tactics. I am ashamed, even humiliated, to think that I can trace my ancestors back to that country. Maybe it isn't the country, but the leaders that have planned to do so hateful a thing. We cannot hate Germany as much as its leader. Nevertheless, we are Japanese, and a feeling of contempt for such low-handed methods is fully justifiable, I think. We are Americans here, and I think and feel the same as any other peoples, but we also have to suffer the humiliations of such truth as this. If it will make us even more strongly Americans in every way, I don't mind that we should be made to suffer for it. I hope this will give us a chance to show we are as American as we can possibly be. If so, I am thankful for the chance. Teddy went so eagerly this morning when the call came for the University ROTC. He has been gone all day, but I hope he'll be back and is safe in whatever he is doing. He said he would be the first to volunteer in case of such an emergency, so I know he is serving gladly, as are many of his friends. 104 were killed and 300 injured are the news reports from the mainland. Radio stations here are cut off except for important reports that are official. We are going into blackout at dusk and we must boil hot water that we drink. Emergency units, construction workers, defense, and everybody like that has been called to help. I'm sure most menfolk are gone. This is war, but it is so incredible. The sun continues to set over Waikiki. It is quiet except for the wind in the trees. There is no panic. Neighbors talk together. We prepare buckets of water, and we are told to be calm. I'm sure our military forces are strong enough to ward off any attack. Whatever happened, they were caught off guard this morning. I heard the dull roar of shooting this morning. The telephone was disconnected, so that's how we found out about this all first. I hope and pray it won't be worse than this. It is the beginning of something terrible in political and economic relations between East and West, there is no doubt. Japan is committing suicide, but let her do so if this is her method. Jimmy is there, but this is no time for hope for official protection because he is my brother. We choose our ways to go, and this is so. It cannot be helped at a time like this. So thank you for listening through all that. I'm going to dissect a little bit of what we said now, and then we'll go through it more. So as you know, she had talked about the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And at 8 o'clock a.m. on December 7, 1941, the Empire of Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, killing about 2,400 people, injuring over 1,000 more. And you know the story. They took out most of the Pacific Fleet there. She talked about how they were surprised and caught off guard by this. But when my grandfather talked about it, he said that in the fall of 1941, or in the summer of 1941, so before the bombing, when he was coming home from Wisconsin, people told him, even at the different military posts, people told him, you need to hurry and get back to Kauai. They told him that something was coming, and he didn't want to get stuck on the U.S. mainland. He wanted to get home as soon as he could. So they would tell him, Chief. That was what they called him, because he was Japanese American, he wasn't white, so a lot of people thought that he was Native American. So wherever he went, Chief, you need to get home, because something is going to happen. And this was what happened. If you ever get a chance, I'm going to put in a plug for Hawaii now. Go to visit the Arizona Memorial and go to visit Pearl Harbor in Hawaii if you can. It is a sight to see. So in that reflection that I read to you, Nao Kusukiyama, my grandmother, she talks about her brother Ted. Ted had been a member of the University of Hawaii ROTC. He had this training in the military, and so when the bombs were dropped in Pearl Harbor, he went immediately to the University of Hawaii to volunteer for service. He immediately got sent home. He and the other Japanese Americans, the other Nisei, who were wanting to volunteer for service, were rejected. They were worried. People were worried that they were actually going to be spies, and they were going to do more harm than good. So they got rejected. They weren't able to join up with the Victory Varsity Volunteers. But later on, they're going to keep trying to volunteer. They're going to keep trying to be the patriots that they are. So they'll do things like distributing gas masks and digging trenches, and they'll help out that way. Later on, he will become part of the 442nd. For those of you who are familiar with the 442nd or are not familiar with the 442nd, that is the all-Japanese American battalion. They become the most decorated unit of that size. And in Texas, we talk about how they even rescued the lost battalion of the Texas National Guard. So he joined the 442nd and does military intelligence. Because he could speak Japanese, they used him to translate information that came from Japan. So for a lot of the war, he was stationed in Burma, and he would just translate all of this information. He wrote letters home, and when we saw those letters, which they also kept, there's all these gaps that have been cut out of the letters. Because he had been telling his mother what they had done and what they were up to, they had to censor the letters, so they cut out the holes before they got those sent home. And so we have some information about him. The other brother that my grandmother mentioned at the end, where she talks about Jimmy, who is in Japan, her older brother, Jimmy, went to the NYU, New York University, for an engineering degree. And this was in the 1930s, so you can imagine how rare that was to find somebody of Japanese descent at NYU. But because he was Japanese American, he couldn't get a job when he was done with his college years. They wouldn't hire him because of his ancestry. So he went to Japan to look for a job. When the war came, he was stuck in Japan. He was essentially held there against his will, and he couldn't come home for the duration of the war. His family didn't know what had happened to him because he couldn't get any communication to them. So that was part of her family story as well. In February of 1942, President Roosevelt issues Executive Order 9066, which essentially set up internment camps for Japanese Americans and anyone else that was seen as being a danger to the country. Over 120,000 Japanese Americans were put into these, or over 120,000 people were put into these camps. Most of them Japanese or Japanese American. 2/3 were American citizens. Neither of my grandparents or their families were put into these internment camps. But as we found in Hawaii and in the rest of the United States, quite a few of them, quite a few people had to experience this even though they were loyal American citizens. So this is one of the internment camps in Hawaii, and this is the Sand Island Detention Center. You can see that they were living there in tents. So in Hawaii, not all Japanese Americans could be put into the internment camp. They couldn't fit that many people. Over 30% of the Hawaiian population, of Hawaii's population in the 1940s were Japanese or Japanese American. And so they couldn't fit all of those people into internment camps. They also realized that if they did put all Japanese Americans into internment camps, the economy would shut down because 1/3 of the workers would be gone. And so they just had a few, as I was growing up, my neighbor next door, he had been put into an internment camp. He was an American citizen. He was born in the United States. He was born in Hawaii, so he was an American citizen. But he was interned because he was seen as suspicious. He owned a radio store, and so the government was sure that he had been communicating with Japan, and he was sure that he was a loyal citizen. So when I talked to him about this for a high school project in the 90s, he was still very upset because to him, he was a loyal American, and he had no doubt where his loyalties lay, but he had been put into an internment camp just because he was seen as suspicious. Here's another picture of one in Hawaii. You can see the barbed wire keeping them in. So once Pearl Harbor is bombed, martial law is instituted into the territory of Hawaii. And so the military comes in and they tell people what they are allowed to do and what they're not allowed to do. So by 7 o'clock that night, the citizens of Hawaii see the military taking control, trying to keep them as safe as possible. And you can see here, you can see them putting the barbed wire up. People are going to be required to use gas masks. You can see the training there. They all learn how to do it. You can be fined if you weren't wearing a gas mask when you were told that you needed to. There will be curfews. And I'll come to this one in just a moment. My book talks about my grandfather. Because he was an industrial arts teacher, he had training. He could build things. So he talks about building these chicken coops with a little light in it because you needed to keep the chicks warm so that they wouldn't get too cold overnight. But because of martial law and they had to black out everything, they couldn't have any light shining, he had to just have like a tiny little light, enough to keep the chickens warm, but not enough that it could be spotted by enemy planes that were coming over. And so they all prepare for this, and they must listen to the military because that's what martial law is all about. So as I went through the letters, I read all of this, and I realized how it talks so much about the personal impact of the bigger picture of what was going on in terms of the military. But at the heart of it, it's a love story. It's courtship letters between a 20-something-year-old man and a 20-something-year-old woman. And there's also that economic difference that they had because he grew up so poor and because she grew up so middle class. So there's class differences as well. And as I was reading through the letters, it's funny stories. Like my grandmother talks about how they would USO the soldiers, and you all know what USOing is. But I asked her, what does USOing mean? Because according to her, you could USO in different ways. You were told to be friendly to the soldiers. Now, how friendly you wanted to be, I think people interpret it differently. So she would tell us stories about how they would go to picnics with the men. They were told to sit next to the men at church. They were told to dance with the soldiers. But at first, not if you were Japanese American. The Chinese American women could, the Hawaiian women could, but if you were Japanese American, you couldn't, because then you might be using your feminine wiles to get information from them. So the Japanese women weren't allowed to do that. But after a while, I guess they realized that they were loyal citizens as well. So she would tell me stories about her army boyfriends, as they were called. So she would go riding in the jeeps with the army boyfriends. She learned how to shoot a gun, which I think is unfathomable to imagine my grandmother shooting a gun. And I remember she was telling me the story. She said, but you know, the only man I ever did kiss was my dear husband. And she got this very nostalgic look in her face. And then she said, oh, no, he wasn't. And then she got up and she walked away. So I never heard the end of that story. I don't know who was the other man that she had been kissing. And she never told me. And so as she's telling, as they're writing to each other, she's telling my grandfather to be about going on all of these adventures with the men. And I can just imagine him thinking, what is going on? Right? What kind of reputation is my possible future wife going to have? So in return, he tells her things like, I saw my ex-girlfriend the other day, because now they're starting to sniff at each other. So we get his side of the story, which is not nearly as exciting as hers, because he's on Kauai for part of the time, which is very rural, and he's teaching industrial arts, and the boys have all gone away, so the boys don't come to school. They're busy putting barbed wire up on the beaches, or they're digging trenches, they're doing the manual labor, they're working in the sugar fields, because regular workers have gone to fight in the war. So he talks about how he's teaching the girls in his shop class how to make steel. Then he tells them, go home and practice and bring me the cookies to eat. And so that was part of his experiences during World War II. As I read through these letters, it was very interesting to see how my grandparents, whom I couldn't ever imagine as young 20-somethings, right, have had this whole different experience, not just because they had to live through war, but because of their race. In Hawaii, as I said, Japanese Americans made up over 30% of the population. As early as 1920, a sociologist from Hawaii talked about how there's no racial tolerance in Hawaii, because racial tolerance would mean one race is better than the other. In Hawaii, we have racial harmony instead, which I thought was a really nice way for him to put it. But as you read through this, the tolerance against Japanese Americans wasn't very high. So my grandmother talks about how she would write her letters, and they would get read by her principal to make sure that she wasn't giving any information that she wasn't supposed to. Or she talks about how when they were waiting in line to get on the plane to go from one island to the next, for when she had to go home, she wouldn't be able to get a seat because Japanese Americans got seated last. And so towards the end of the letters, we see her trying desperately to get back to Oahu for her wedding. They had made enough progress that my grandfather had proposed to her, and she had just about a week left to make sure she got from the Big Island back to Oahu. And so she talks about how she had to put on her fancy red dress to talk to the officer that was in charge of getting their flight arrangements. And she talked about how there's a very specific order for the way that you could board. So whites first, right, and then Chinese Americans, then Hawaiians, and then if there's any seat left, then Japanese Americans would be let on. So just in time, she does get home and she does get married. And we'll go through and see. This is just one of the pictures that we have that I found about them USOing the soldiers. And then here's when, as she gets home, Hawaiian Airlines was one of the few airlines that were in existence there. And I wanted to put up this picture right as I talked about them, because they had very strict guidelines for flight attendants. You had to be between 5'2" and 5'6". You had to be slender. You had to be a native Hawaiian. And the line that I don't know how they even got away with this, you had to be free of acne and glasses. And so they had very specifics for what was required. But she did get on the flight, and then she got home and she was able to get married. You can see here a very American-looking wedding, right? Not a Japanese-looking wedding at all. They asked for bonds for their wedding presents when people wanted to know what they wanted, because that was the way that they could be patriotic, and that was the way that they could start to build up their nest egg as well. So they got married in 1943, and this is a picture of their family that they had. My mom is there, and then that's her brother on the end. So that is the story that I have in my book, In Love and War. But before I end here, I wanted to ask you a question. Go on to the next one, please. Okay. This is the question that I want to talk about for just a few minutes here. Turn to the person next to you and ask them this question. What are you? And I want to know what some of the answers are. So ask the person next to you, what are you? Okay, so does anyone have an answer that they would like to just shout out and share? What are you? Okay, American. So how many of you, American was the first thing that you said? American was the first thing. I used to get this question a lot when I was doing my research. People would come up to me and they would say, what are you? And I didn't understand what they were asking. And so first I would be like, a girl? You know, no. What are you? So, I'm a student, I thought maybe they were asking why I was researching. It took me a long time to figure out, and I think this is because I'm from Hawaii, where race is understood a little bit differently. They were asking me what my ethnic heritage was. They wanted to know where quote, I was from. But answering I'm from Hawaii wasn't the answer that they wanted either. They wanted to know what my ethnic heritage was. So I'm Japanese American, that is my answer. But when I think, if you were to ask Audie, what are you? He would probably have said an American. That would have been his first answer. For Audie, my anti-Audie here, I'm not sure that would have been his first answer. I think his first answer would have been, I'm a son. Because his whole upbringing led him to a closer connection to his family. I talked about how he didn't want to be drafted. He wanted to stay in Hawaii. He wanted to be able to earn enough money to pay his family back for the money that they had spent for him to go to Wisconsin to get an education. He wanted to be sure that that money wasn't wasted. And so that's part of why he wanted to stay in Hawaii and continue to be a teacher. But when we looked at his letters, he was still an American. He was loyal to the United States. He participated however he could volunteering. He complained about being drafted, and he certainly didn't want to be drafted. But for him, he believed that he could better serve his family by being a school teacher rather than being drafted into the military. So when I think about what are you, I think about how, for them, they're both Americans, even though their ethnic heritage is different. Which led me to my last discovery, and again, thank you to Melissa and the Audie Murphy Research Foundation. In terms of differences and similarities, Yoshiharu Ogata's daughter-in-law was white. So his son married a white woman. For Audie Murphy, I found out that his daughter-in-law was Japanese American. I found out that Terry Murphy married a Japanese American woman. And so when we think about what are you, I'm going to go with I'm an American, regardless of my ethnic background. I know where my loyalties lie. I know that I'm a citizen of the United States. And as we see, that came in many different forms. So thank you so much.